Welcome to the MaxArc podcast, where we awaken together and share our greatest gifts with the world. I'm really excited about my guest today, Ric Weinman, the present-day founder of VortexHealing. Welcome, Ric.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So before we dive deeper into what Vortex Healing is and how this can help healing in many different levels and also facilitate awakening, I would love if you could share like a brief overview of your life before you met Vortex Healing and the Merlin lineage, especially your spiritual path. I see in the background you have there photos of your teachers, so maybe you could share what was your spiritual journey to awakening before Vortex Healing.
Okay. Well, I was a mess, which is fertile ground for something else to grow out of it. I was a senior in college, and my father died, and my mother went into a black hole, and I just, felt like I was drowning. And I graduated and went to Europe and hitchhiked around. Didn't have any particular destination. I would just go wherever the rides took me. But in the state I was in, and I had asthma at the time, and uh, and I decided to go cold turkey off asthma medication. And the combination of just sort of avoiding what was coming up for me, as well as when I would eat, I would sort of feel it loading in my chest. I basically didn't eat. I went into kind of a starvation place, which actually went on for years, and I got very, very, very out there. And to the extent to which one day I'd been walking all day carrying a backpack, hadn't eaten a thing, and I took a bite of a tomato, and I got a rush like I just shot speed. And something in me said, this isn't supposed to happen from a tomato. Um, but yeah, that's just where I was. And, wherever I would be, I would start meditating. And in that out there, disconnected state, I sort of made a new level of connection. And, and then my path became bringing that connection in. And um, I ended up in Tucson, Arizona, and started to do some healing work. Um, I was, the psychic surgeon from the Philippines had come through town, and in the waiting room, I connected with a woman who was studying Jinshin Jitsu. And I thought it'd be nice to do a trade. I didn't really have anything to trade, so I sort of created something internally on the spot, and we did a trade, and whatever I created sort of blew her away.
Can you explain more about what you mean by you created that in that moment?
Sure. So I needed something to trade, and I thought, okay, I can do an aura balancing. And I didn't really have a great preconception of what that would mean, but I'm very good at sort of following the energy, and so I created this aura balancing, working through her chakras and stuff, um, and she never had one of these blow away experiences, and I said, "Be careful what you ask for," and flew her away, and she wanted to turn me into her guru, which I refused. um, but through her, I started to take classes in Jinshin Jitsu, and
Can you briefly explain what Jinshin Jitsu is?
sure. Jinshin Jitsu is basically an energy balancing technique. It's a Japanese technique. It's similar but different than acupuncture. Um, Acupuncture, you might say, works with the manifested energy system, and Jinshin works with the manifesting energy system. So there's a lot of overlap, but it's a different level of pathways. And where acupuncture, you're working with points. In Jinshin, you're working with um, they call them safety energy locks. I call them nodes. And they could be like 3 inches in diameter, like for instance, this whole area could be like, number 21, for instance, as opposed to some spot. And you hold 2 points and you wait for the energy to harmonize and go on and, kind of like that. So I was working with Jinshin and I took some cranial sacral and I had ended up dating this woman who was a hairdresser who was very excited about the aura balancing work. And she said, "Oh, you need to teach this." And I said, "Okay." She said, I'm gonna bring some of my clients together and, you're gonna teach it." And so at that time I was using one particular energy, kind of the sun type energy, for aura balancing, but I realized that for different people, different kinds of energies might work better. So that night I came up with a couple of other ways to channel, and she put together this workshop and I taught it, and that became my first book, which was Your Hands Can Heal, which got published in 7 different languages. And so it just sort of happened.
Mm-hmm.
And, um, but I had a full-time healing practice for, I don't know, maybe 15 years, something like that. Um, at one point I was living in a place and my next door neighbor, this woman, looked like she was going to have a nervous breakdown. And so I offered to do a healing on her and it had a really powerful effect on her. And so her husband turned out to be a reporter and, wanted to do a story and he did a story and, I went from being a part-time healer to being, full-time healer like overnight. It was published in the main paper. And sort of simultaneous with this, I had been in graduate school for computer science of all things. And it's kind of a longer story around that. And I had just dropped out of it. And when the article came out, I mean, so it was perfect divine timing because all of a sudden I had all this space and now I had a full-time healing practice. And I, my own concept of the time of awakening was that you had to clean everything out. It's like when everything was cleaned out, then all that's left is awakeness. But of course, it's actually impossible to clean everything out because you've got eons of incarnational history and eons of ancestral history, and consciousness just is designed to retain things, and so. So where did it? So at some point, I was still very much out there, way out there. And I had a psychic friend who said whenever she would try to connect with me, she would, reach out to wherever she saw me, and she would get dizzy because I was so far out there. Um, and and then somewhere along the line, um, I was still in starvation, um, but very slowly making my way back into the body. Um, and, my body didn't even know how to digest food still at that point. So it was a slow process.
For how many years were you in starvation?
A few, 3 to 4, I'd say. Hmm. I mean, I lost all my muscle mass, my bones hollowed out. But my nervous system became really refined, out of that, you can imagine. And so I started to develop some psychic abilities, which is easier in Tucson for anyone who wants to be psychic. Tucson's a good place to do it. The dry electric type air just makes that, easier. Um, that same psychic friend who would get dizzy said she would be more psychic when she would visit in Tucson. Um, and it was funny how that developed. I had this kind of weird tarot deck called Morgan's Tarot, which isn't a regular tarot deck at all, but someone had given it to me as a gift, and I was playing with it, and I was doing some readings. Um, And one day, as I turned over a card, I realized I was getting a vibration off the card that was telling me something different than whatever my mind would have told me. And I was sort of shocked because I had a preconception of people who were psychic, what it meant to be a psychic, and I had a preconception of myself, and the two images didn't fit. Um, so very slowly, though, I'd be interacting with people, and I would say it's as if I see, because I didn't really know if I was seeing it or not. It was all very tentative, and then I would get feedback from people, and apparently I was being pretty accurate. So, so that's how sort of the sensing came in. And then I had this guru for a while, and he was not the real deal. He had real power. This little Indian guy, but he was not clean. He was breaking up families, sleeping with the wives while he was preaching celibacy, but he had real power, and he would get in your head in a way that one woman who left ended up committing suicide, probably because she couldn't get him out of her head. Um, anyway, I got him out of my head. That's a different story. Um, but at some point, I ended up at Kripalu Yoga Center taking a yoga retreat. And I had started reading this book called Miracle of Love by Ram Dass, stories about Qualia Baba. And I would feel this pull, but I'd been burned, by this, and so I would pull back and forth. And I was in the middle of a yoga posture when all of a sudden something in me reached out and Neem Karoli Baba came pouring in. And I laughed and cried and felt like I'd come home. My life just turned. And so for years, I was just, working with Baba. I didn't really care about awakening. From wherever I was, all I wanted was to sort of, sit under Baba's blanket kind of thing. But, that wasn't my path, and he would sort of push me out. I came somewhere along the line, I encountered Amma, who became a major uh, process for me, you might say, and Mother Mira, and at some point, Karoli Baba, sort of pushed me out to Mother Mira and said, go study with her. And she seemed scary to me at the time. I mean, I would tune into her and I'd feel these waves of silence as opposed to this, warm, heartful, Baba stuff. And he would sort of jowl me, anyway, so that was the process. And at that point, things were starting to cook on sort of the awakening path level. There's something we call karmanauts, which are these incarnational issues that people come in with. And so if you imagine you have these incarnational issues, and when you come into your form, they sort of line up in the karmic body and the spine. They look like these little, very tiny, tiny dots of pure separation consciousness surrounded by some kind of issue consciousness. And so Baba had made me aware of these. I was reading Mother Mira's book, and she was talking about how she would untie these knots. And I thought, what are these? Baba, what are these? And he just came in and popped one open, and I realized what it was. And so then I started working with pictures of Mother Mira, and I would just sit in my spine and just, I don't consider her an avatar, but a very, very fine bridge for avataric energy.
Can you explain what you define as avatar?
An avatar is a direct incarnation of the divine. There's not really a being there. There isn't someone with history and so on. And Mother Mira, to me, is a being with history, but is this very deep channel for bridging in divine energy. And so I would sit with her picture and bring it like into my spine. It would hit a karma knot, and I would just sit and, and just sit there, and all this stuff would come out, and for hours, and then pop, and all this light would come through, and then I'd go to the next one, and I went through all my karma knots that way, and and that creates a certain kind of awakening, not a true awakening, but it's like something has started to wake up in the form. The energy system goes through an evolution when that last karma knot goes, um, and so as things progressed, um, I I became aware of this. You might say, after you lose your last karma knot, it's like whatever that movement is, it wants to go deeper. And there are these, we sort of mapped it out as it would go through level by level by level, and 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 um, and then I think I was sitting meditating with Amma, where I became aware of what I call the core veil. That this was like kind of the core of the sense of separateness that the psyche used to refer to itself in separate ways in the system. And I remember sitting and meditating with it, and at that point, I knew I didn't have much left of it. And I was sitting meditating. I asked Amma inside. I was at one of her programs. What happens when this goes? And I heard her say, "There's nowhere left to hide." Anyway, jumping ahead, at some point I'm married and I have a young child, and he's maybe 3 years old, and we're on a holiday in Colorado and in a hotel room, and the two of them are playing on the floor, and I'm sitting in the bed meditating, and I feel this. At that point, I was already vortex healing. Some had already happened. I'm sort of on the awakening thing here. I don't need to come back, circle around, try to cover a lot. It's a big question. I'm trying to answer. And so I'm already, working with vortex healing at the time, and I would get this little, almost like, where your inbox goes, bing, you've got mail. I would have this sort of inner mailbox, sort of in the eighth chakra, and I went there and I had some kind of thing from Merlin. I thought it was maybe a transmission for a new class, and I downloaded it, and all of a sudden, everything sort of shifted inside, and the sense of I and the way I normally experienced it was gone. I could think I, but it was just in my head. It's like it didn't mean anything anymore. And if I went back to, let's say, a memory from the day before where I was there, I could see the I being there in the memory, but if I looked at it closely, it was just empty. And there was this new space in my heart that was just this place of beingness that had no I in it. I call it a no I zone. And it was very confusing because I would, be up in my head, and I drop into the heart, and so it was kind of a schizoid kind of experience. I asked my psychic friend at the time, because this isn't how I imagined awakening would be. I had all kinds of preconceptions, and she said, "See if it lasts," which it did, and I was like that for about a year, and I went and saw Adi Shanti, and I told him about my experience and how I'd been schizoid for about a year like that, and he looked at me and smiled and said, "Only a year?" He said the biggest block to deepening in the awakening would be preconceptions about what awakening should look like. So that's how awakening came in, and eventually we started to find a way to help students with that. But with Vortex healing,
yeah, please bring us to the point where you first consciously came in contact with Merlin and the Vortex healing lineage.
So So somewhere along all that story that I've just unfolded, um, when I would go into like a hotel room, I would want to clear the space. Um, because if you don't clear the space, like you're sleeping in the middle of all this other stuff that everyone else is sort of, imprinted into the atmosphere. Like once I went into a hotel room and I was tired and forgot to clear the space. I lay down in bed and immediately there's this 3D image of what most recently happened in that bed. so, um, so I would clear the space by sitting down and sort of spreading my field out through the space, and it was slow and not very efficient. And one day I sort of remembered I had some past life connection to some energy that I could sort of gather and pull on, and just like kind of like in this Disney Sorcerer's Apprentice, just intended to do something and it would go and do it. And it was very magical, and it would do a much better job of anything I could do before, and it left everything like bright and clear. And one day, visiting for like Thanksgiving at my mother's house, I went to clear the room I was going to sleep in. And as I pulled on that energy, it was like it opened this trap door in creation. And suddenly my feet were still on the ground, but the rest of me was out in some interdimensional vortex. And this voice started to talk to me out of that vortex, telling me I'd studied this in past lives and it was time to start to use it again. And I was a full-time healer at the time, and knew what I could do and what I couldn't do, and so I started to use it, and I started to get these amazing healings. Like this one guy came in who had been using ginseng on himself for like 20 years. He had chronic fatigue, in Europe often known as ME, and he had been using ginseng to keep the symptoms, down. And he knew when he got off the table, it was gone. And I went to India to see a spiritual master named Papaji, also known as H.W. Punja. And he would, a lot of story in that, but he would sort of indicate, oh, have you heard of so-and-so? He's got this and that going on. And I would take that as a directive, to go and work on that person. And one woman, for instance, had gotten 2 simultaneous cases of hepatitis, and on a trip with one of his helpers, and I could see these 2 viral swirls. She wasn't yellow, different kinds of hepatitis, but I could see these 2 viral swirls in her liver. And in the 4th session, they cleared out all of her energy. She was flat on her back, had no energy. They told her she'd be like that for life. In the middle of the 4th session, these swirls disappeared. All this energy came flooding back in her body. She was back on her feet. And this guy...
Can you explain, like, when you say you saw that, how did you see that in her, these swirls?
I just, psychically.
Can you explain a bit more, like how do you sense that, like visually, or?
Yeah, for me it's visual. Well, it's visual in consciousness. I mean, different psychics. I don't think of myself as a psychic, even though obviously I'm very psychic. But different psychics see in different ways. For me, it's sort of like something connects to the oneness of consciousness and then presents visually whatever it is that needs to be seen. So Papaji directed me to this other person, this guy who had acute leukemia, and he was getting blood transfusions every week or two. And to my sensing, it looked to me like he had a subclinical virus in his bone marrow, that his immune system kept trying to get to it and couldn't, so it was overactive, doing whatever his system was doing, and I knocked out the virus. And viruses leave a certain energetic signature. That's how you see them. I knocked out the virus, and a month later, all of his blood indicators were normal. And a third one there that I remember was this woman come up to me asking if I'd work on her husband. She would make me dinner, trade dinner for work on her husband, who was kind of irritable all the time and tired and this and that. And I could see that he had had hepatitis years before, but it hadn't really cleared out of his liver. His liver still had this sort of yellow overlay in it, to my sensing. And so I agreed, and I worked on his liver, and it cleared with whatever these new tools were. It cleared in just a few minutes, and it was done. And you could see they were disappointed because they thought I was going to work on them for 45 minutes. But to their credit, they gave me dinner anyway. The next day, she comes running up to me saying, "He's a new man. He's a new man." It's like someone beamed him out last night and beamed someone else in, and I like the new one, much better. Thank you. He's been sweet. He's been helpful. He helped me with the dishes. He's got energy. So people were seeing this and were wanting to learn it. And I really didn't really know how I was doing it per se, in that, I'd gotten this kind of past life memory activated, and I sort of knew how to do it. I would drop into a particular place and have certain intentions and so on, and it would work. But how am I going to teach this to other people? And but I thought, okay, I got so the voice that had originally spoken to me in the vortex, and identified itself as Merlin. And Merlin was actually this being named Mahindra, who lived some 5,600 years ago. But at some point, and he taught, but it wasn't the Merlin lineage at that point in time. It was just this avatar, Mahindra, who had 3 temples in northern India. But at some point, some thousands of years later, there was someone meditating in the what's now England, who was close to awakening, and Mahindra came into his dream, or into his meditation, and presented him with this, call it this healing awakening package, and identified himself as Merlin because Merlin was the closest name in that language, which would have been English-ish language, to the magical vibration, of the lineage, because the lineage brings in, every divine lineage brings in some quality of divinity, and this brings in this quality of magical transformation. And so working with that, this being woke up, had an awakening, and started to teach, the healing and the meditation of, this, of Mahindra, which he knew as Merlin. And he became the first regular human, regular like you and me, incarnational. He became like Merlin 1, the first Merlin lineage. And the avatar, Mahindra, we sort of refer to as Merlin 0. He's sort of he's still the source of the lineage, and powers it. And the tradition became that when someone who is a teacher of vortex healing reached a certain level of oneness with Merlin 0, that they would take on the name Merlin as a title. And so like the King Arthur Merlin is like the 4th Merlin in the lineage. And so we've had teachers that weren't Merlins, and then we've had, like I'm the 13th Merlin in the lineage. And it was lost a couple of times and then recovered however it needed to be recovered, just as I recovered it when it was time. I mean, I wasn't even looking for it. it found me, knocked me on the head and said, "Phew, here you are, time to start doing this." And I started sort of refounded, you might say, the lineage that way. I'd studied it in 2 past lives.
And I learned from Anthony Gorman, he talked about Jesus and vortex healing and the lineage. Could you share something about that?
Sure. So, most people aren't aware of it, but Jesus traveled around with his uncle, who was a trader, and I think his Saint Joseph of Arimathea, and Jesus was looking for spiritual teaching. Now, Jesus was an avatar, but for however he needed to teach, he needed to sort of stay more within his human separation consciousness, and he didn't like fully wake up to his own true nature until later. And so he was going around looking for teachers. And in England, he found whoever the local Merlin was at the time, and Jesus, took the training. And at the time, the initial transmission used to sit here, which we call the vortex wheel. It's sort of technical reasons we don't need to get into unless you want to. But when Jesus got the wheel, it dropped from here to here in him, and because
so from the third eye to the heart, or
from the third eye, sixth chakra area, which for me the two aren't the same, dropped into the heart, and because of the power of who he was as an avatar, it simultaneously created that shift in the lineage. So anyone that had ever taken it, whether it was alive that was taking it, the wheel dropped to the heart, where it's stayed since then. So Jesus left his definite fingerprint on the lineage.
Can you explain what's the difference between vortex healing and other forms of energy healing like Reiki?
Okay. So we're grateful to Reiki because Reiki made energy healing a more household word. And although the founder of it was connected, had his divine connection, you might say he densified whatever he was going to teach to a slower vibrational level. So like if you think of like divinity as being like the highest vibration, and spiritual energy being more, it's spiritual energy and divine energy aren't the same. They have different vibrational energies. Like we have a spiritual body, emotional body, etc., mental body, etheric body, and the spiritual body vibrates with spiritual energy, and so a lot of people when they meditate are really connecting to spiritual energy as opposed to divine energy. It's I don't know how to differentiate in a way that I can't think of an example that would make it easier for people to understand the difference other than, kind of like octaves that way. So divine energy being higher frequency has much deeper penetration and can awaken separation. Right? Spiritual energy can transform things to a certain degree, but only to a certain degree because it doesn't have the power to awaken. It's not deep enough, but it sort of it becomes sort of the carrot on the path. So it's easier for people to relate, most people who aren't on a spiritual path, to relate to spiritual energy because it's more familiar to them. They already have that in their field, in their spiritual body. So they feel that and they resonate with it and they go, and that makes me feel good, right? And that helps me come back into my heart And so it becomes sort of this opening on the path, but the path itself, if one's going to awaken, needs to go deeper. So Reiki works with that spiritual energy. All these forms of Reiki, they're all, you know, working with spiritual energy. And it's a great thing that was created because, you know, everyone and their brother can teach it. So it becomes, you know, an easy thing to spread. Um, but with something like Vortex Healing, which is working completely with divine energy and consciousness, there's a whole other power in it. And, you know, transmitting that power isn't something that everyone and their brother can do. In fact, most of the people that I've seen that have, people almost have to be born with a certain kind of energetic spine. And most of the people that I've encountered as students who have that have become vortex healing teachers. And so that number is very small. Probably in total, I've probably only encountered maybe about a dozen people who, you know, could have been vortex healing teachers, and most of those at some point were. Um, you know, I got a student one time who didn't understand why she couldn't be a vortex healing teacher, and I ended up, I think it was, I can't remember if I did a session on her or if it was in a class, and her whole body was sort of shaking from the energy of whatever happened to her. I said, so imagine needing to have the, whatever energy created that in you, imagine needing to be able to generate that for a whole group of people. So, so she got it. Um, so, um, so to me, Reiki is sort of, you know, it's a relaxing, you know, feel good, creates a certain kind of harmony whenever you can make someone feel good. It's going to harmonize and, you know, and kind of resonate. Um, Vortex healing just has this depth of healing power and awakening ability. So, for instance, as the work got deeper, I used to have something called Gilbert syndrome, which is a genetic condition. And the bilirubin enzyme, as a liver enzyme, goes up, which is how they diagnose it in blood tests. And there's nothing they can do for it. As the work got deeper, a transmission came in for shifting genetic expression. And you know, so we're not talking about feeling good. We're talking about getting in and shifting genetic expression. My bilirubin levels are perfectly normal now. I actually managed to shift it. Now, the thing is I know nothing about, you know, what genes do what. You know, on a human mental knowing level, I wouldn't have a clue how to shift that genetic expression. But this is the power of vortex healing, is that the divine intelligence within the transmission is omniscient. It knows. And so all I have to do is tune into the transmission, if I have a transmission for the genetics, and intend for it to do a particular thing, and it goes and it does it. And when it's done, it's just done. If I catch a bug and get on it early, a virus, I can usually knock that out in about a minute if I catch it early. Mhm. Um, on a emotional level, see, all our emotional stuff is all rooted in this separation consciousness, and you need, only divinity can really wake that up. And so, you know, at the root of all of our issues is some spot of separateness. I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, you know, way more to it than that. But to get to the roots of issues, you need to be able to wake up the consciousness, the separation consciousness that's in the story, that's in the drama, that's in the mirrored reflection of all this memory generating, you know, this emotional position. You know, things like Reiki and other, and things like Jinshin that are balancing the body in some way. Um, just they just can't get to it. It just doesn't have the penetrating, transformative, awakening ability, or that kind of intelligence in it that can do that.
Mm-hmm. There are so many avenues to go deeper in, but I would like you to, you mentioned the bodies before, and in vortex healing there are different levels of bodies, like the physical, astral, mental, and so on. Can you explain in an overview the different types of bodies that vortex healing sees and that we can work with?
Well, you have the physical, etheric, emotional, mental, spiritual. The nervous system has its own energy body, and the digestive system does as well. And so they all have different functions, both physically and emotionally. So your emotional body becomes a vehicle for experiencing and expressing emotion. Mental body is a vehicle for experiencing and expressing mental activity, and so on. Really that simple. Mm-hmm.
So when we use the word the astral body, is it the same? Is it the same as when I say I'm practicing astral projections? That's the same astral body?
Yeah, you use your astral. When we dream, when we're asleep, we go out in our astral body and have adventures, some of which show up in our dreams. Yeah, we're not very big into astral stuff. For us, that's really low level stuff. Our focus is on transforming places that we're stuck in and awakening more deeply. And astral travel really doesn't play much of a role in that. And in terms of tuning into things that are at a distance, you don't need astral travel to do that, because consciousness, it's all connected, it's all one. So your awareness, which sits in your consciousness, can just extend elsewhere. And so you can pick up on, let's say like vortex healing works really well at a distance. And for various reasons, but in terms of tuning into someone who's at a distance, awareness just goes there. It can move freely through consciousness, and consciousness is all connected. It's just gotten used to kind of living within certain boundaries, and I'm not someone, as I walk down the street, where I'm picking up on what everyone else is thinking. Thank God. I knew someone that used to, and it would get a little overwhelming for her. But for me, whenever I might want to, I can do that.
Mm-hmm. So you used the word awareness and consciousness a lot. I think it would be great to get the definition of those two words within the vortex healing model.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting because not all languages have, like Spanish doesn't have two words for it. And so in order to differentiate, I call awareness the light in consciousness. The light of consciousness is awareness. And that starts to kind of create a clue. So for me, in the beginning there, it's all, of course, it's all divinity. But there is this creation that's going to be created. And so there's this arising, you might say.
You say in the beginning, you mean like in the beginning of the cosmos?
Creation.
Of universe?
Yes. Yeah. Right. There's, and even the idea of beginning is all sort of conceptual. Because ultimately there is no beginning, because divinity isn't restricted to time. But in the beginning of the time of this creation, there's what you might say, there's this arising. And this arising is this field of awareness that has localized areas, that divinity uses what we call divine thread to localize, create and so kind of like if you're in a room and there are light bulbs on, you've got the single field of light in the room, but you have these localized areas of it. So in a similar way, you've got this field of consciousness with localized areas that aren't completely separate, but are localized. And
So consciousness in your language is the everythingness?
no, I haven't gotten to
What is
consciousness yet.
okay.
I have to start with awareness.
Yeah.
And awareness is really like awareness, light, love, intelligence. It's all of that, but we sort of use the word awareness to just sort of point to it. And
So is awareness the everythingness, or
so we'll get to that.
okay?
So you can't create. You need other qualities besides what this awareness, light, love, intelligence brings in order to generate a creation. Awareness doesn't self-reflect, for instance. It doesn't have memory. It doesn't have density. And so divinity does this very magical trick, kind of like if you think of how water can be turned into ice. It's the same stuff, but now it has different properties. Yep. You know, you're not going to knock someone out by throwing a bunch of water at them, but if you dropped a block of ice on their head, it has a very different effect. And so in a similar way, divinity takes this awareness, light, love, intelligence, and creates this densifying transformation of it. And now it has a different quality. And what it's created now is consciousness. Okay, so consciousness is really awareness as consciousness. It's like water as ice. It's this, it takes on these other qualities. And awareness is still within it. But now, and this is for us, we call this the original veil. Because, if, in terms of where we first emerge out of divinity as this, localized area of awareness, light, love, intelligence. We've now been densified into this experience of being consciousness, right? And the trick is that we're identified with it. We've now have this veil so that we think we're that. And so in the bigger picture, before you had just one, which was awareness, light, love, intelligence, and now you have awareness and consciousness, right? And so...
And the consciousness you talk about, is that individualized consciousness?
Both. You've got, this field of consciousness within which you now have these localized areas of consciousness.
Which would also be in every human being, for example.
Right. So yeah. So just taking it a step at a time, though. So now you've got these two things, and consciousness, awareness becomes aware of itself through having something to be aware of, and so there's the place where awareness hasn't gone into consciousness becomes sort of awake to itself. And consciousness becomes conscious of its separateness. And so this consciousness of separateness starts to pervade consciousness, including these localized areas. Now, eventually these localized areas, to make a longer story, because we have a whole map of this, eventually those localized areas of separateness consciousness become densified down through dimensions. And the dimensions are created through divinity doing certain things with consciousness in order to physicalize some of that. So consciousness becomes the building block. Because one of the qualities of consciousness is that it's denser compared to awareness, but it also has this ability to reflect. That's how it becomes aware it's separate. It starts to reflect on what that experience is. reflection is how memory happens. So now you've got this stuff that's been created that has some density to it, that can reflect, that can hold memory, and has awareness in it. And so the physical universe is created out of that stuff. And then the beings that move through the universe are created out of those localized areas. Right? So eventually, as that localized area gets densified down, it gets dense enough that it can have what we call an incarnational body. So you've got this densified area of, bless you, that's become this sort of localized awareness within this incarnational body, and you've got a creation for it to, that has bodies, physical bodies for it to be able to incarnate into. So that's like a sort of an overview of our map.
So what is awakening and vortex healing?
So coming back to that map then, on that, okay, so we have to go back to where all that gets localized. At the 10th dimensional level, there's this focal point that gets created that we call the I point. So that becomes like the root of the experience of I at 10th dimensional level. And there's a real deep densification at the 8th dimensional level. But the 6th dimensional level, remember, consciousness is reflecting, and this reflection structure gets set up that we call the core veil. And that becomes the kind of densified sense of I within this incarnational consciousness, within the incarnational being that's then going from life to life. And for us, awakening is so. And the way that I see if someone's awake is I look at their consciousness. I actually just look at their consciousness because I can see that, and I see because the core veil sits in the heart. It's incarnational being comes in, and the center of its sense of I is sitting in the heart, and I see if the consciousness is referencing that. Every time you think I, which is like every second, whether it's referencing that, I. And when the core veil goes, then it's just head thought. There's no reference to that sense of I anymore. It's just mental concept. But the substance of it is lost. So there's still these other levels of dimension of awakening that still need to happen on the path, but there's this fundamental change. And I like to say everything changes, but everything remains the same. Because all that head stuff and all the conditioning and all your attitudes, all that's still there, which definitely was not my preconception. And yet your relationship to it is all changed because it's no longer you, right? You've broken that connection that had you identified with all of that. Now, of course, you have all the habits of it, and you've got the pull of it, the pull of the drama. And yet, even while you're pulled into that drama, there's a place that's sitting there that knows and that is awake to the fact that none of that is you. I remember once I was on a train in England, and I was there with was married for 20 years, and we were in some kind of argument, and suddenly, and I was in the drama of it, and suddenly, like from the place where awakening was, I sort of popped out of it, and it was like, who's having this argument? It's like the argument was just having itself, and I popped out of it, and so I was no longer in the argument, and my wife, who was also awake, immediately sort of got that as well, and she came out of it, and the argument was gone. Because there was no one arguing. It was just drama arguing. It was just conditioning arguing. So everything is the same on the one hand, and yet everything is different. And yet the difference over time starts to change everything that's been the same, because you don't keep reinforcing it through your identity. And so in Vortex Healing, our awakening process is the map that is created of these different levels of I as it got densified down into the core veil, and eventually becomes like karmic issues. That separation creates issues, which creates karma knots. And so the path begins with awakening the karma knots in the early classes until we can awaken students' core veil. And then, we have classes that then take people up this through the dimensions. I call it the I tree. It sort of grew down from the higher dimensions to here. And so we awaken back up the tree until we crack open to a place where divinity then starts to come into, where we have that original awareness, intelligence, awareness, light, love, intelligence. And then we call that awakening to divinity. Now, I have to start talking, though, about our vertical versus our horizontal sort of process.
So you have two vectors of awakening?
Two vectors, yes. We want to get scientific. So, as I said, awakening, everything remains the same and everything changes. And you can keep doing that right up the line, where you can keep waking up deeper and deeper, and without changing any conditioning. And we all know stories of like teachers that have acted unethically, for instance. But the fact that they acted unethically doesn't mean they weren't awake. I mean, some of them
No,
may not have been.
they probably had some shadow, right? That they didn't
Right.
work on.
And that's that human stuff. That's all that conditioning that hasn't changed. And so the process of learning to live from one's awakening, to live from that, we call that embodiment. And that's that horizontal process. So you've got that awakeness. And so, like in that argument I had with my wife at the time on the train, when we're in that argument, in the middle of that, we weren't we weren't living from our awakeness. We weren't being in our awakeness. And then the awakeness came in, and it changed the way we were being. And that shift is what we mean by embodiment. And so you can have very loving, sweet, heartful beings who weren't hurt to fly. I would hurt to fly. If it was harassing me. I'm not adverse to that. And I once asked this yogi, what he would do, with cockroaches in his house. And he said, he wasn't a Buddhist, as you'll see. He said he would lift up his shoe, and as he would come down on the head of the cockroach, he would intend for it to come back as a bumblebee. he was as a honeybee, I should say. He was very big on honey. Anyway, went sideways there a little bit. So you can have very sweet, very loving spiritual beings who aren't awake, and you can have beings that have actually awakened fairly deeply who are basically still assholes. It's an interesting phenomenon.
So how do you make sure in Vortex Healing that people who awaken, that the shadow is like solved and doesn't come out in the world?
We shoot the ones that are assholes. We have no way to ensure that. It's a long-term, lifetime process, of deepening in one's awakeness and learning to live from it. And, some people have no motivation to do that, and some people do, and you can't, very hard to give people motivation. It's something that's arising from a deeper place. And it's interesting, we can talk about that too, because sometimes when people wake up, they they have a major shift in their motivations. Um, you hear stories about that. Like there was this a doctor who woke up and and he lost all motivation, and he just basically stayed in his bed for like uh, I forget if it was a month or 3 months, but his wife brought him food and tea, and then from a deeper place, like because his old motivations were all programmed from his egoic consciousness, and he lost his identity with it. And but sitting in that space of no motivation, a deeper place of motivation arose that was just his sadhana, his path, and then he was up and running again. But and he might have even been doing the same work, but from a different place, right? And um, so motivation has to rise from within, and our way of looking at free will is that the ego doesn't really have any choice about its motivation. It's either there or it isn't. You know, the ego can't say I'm going to be motivated. I mean, and it can try to motivate itself, but you know, that's just a trying to.
Is there free will at all, or is it just karma unfolding, or
Oh,
something else?
there's absolutely free will. It's just that the ego doesn't have any.
Hmm. So who
So,
has free will?
so another way of saying that is that you have free will, but it has a mind of its own. So free will, the very word, says that whatever has free will must be free, right? So only that which is free can express free will, and the only thing that's free is ultimately divinity. So free will is an expression of divinity, which is there in every moment, and it's arising through us. And so the ego, which wants to feel in control, a decision arises that the ego had nothing to do with. The ego will claim it as its own because it arose in its consciousness. But if you look carefully at any moment, decisions arise and then we follow them. Decisions arise and then we follow them. But you can't actually find the place where you, as thinking mind, actually made the decision. You can find all these thoughts about the decision, and then there's just a decision. And and that decision can be something that goes completely against your typical way of functioning, which is the way the divine moves you into a different direction. Or most typically, it's just following your conditioning and letting it play out because, that's the game. So, so free will is operating there in every moment through you, but you as ego do not have free will,
Yeah,
unless you want to
makes
think of
sense
it
to me. Yeah.
as having a mind of its own.
Hmm. I would like to come back to the healing aspect, and I was attending this Kundalini clearing class with Anthony
Mhm.
in London. Can you explain us what's the difference between Kundalini energy and the Kundalini channel itself, and what is the Kundalini clearing doing that we learn as vortex healers?
Yeah. First, just to say that, I've trained a bunch of other teachers, Anthony being one of them. And so he's our European teacher. Um, and so, just as water flows through a pipe, Kundalini energy flows through Kundalini channel. And um, uh, the Kundalini is, I think it has um, I think it's not well understood in the West. Um, on the one hand, one can, first of all, it's not a spiritual energy. Kundalini is not a spiritual energy. It's this dense physical energy that flows up your whole inner spine, and down, rooted in the root chakra. I mean, even the traditional images of it, kind of like a snake rooted in that root. That root chakra is not spiritual. That's your physical, dense survival, chakra. And but the Kundalini, as it rises through the spine, feeds the other chakras, feeds the whole nervous system. And so the main, and it can get blocked through the conditioning where it doesn't flow so well. And so when we clean the channel, it makes it much easier for it to flow, and so it feeds the nervous system better. So that's one thing that happens from that class. But there are yoga practices that use that Kundalini channel to, kind of breathe in certain ways and blast the crown chakra. And when your crown chakra gets blasted, you can go into a certain kind of bliss state, right? The thing is, most of the time, that bliss state is just a particular nervous system state. It's like feeding certain drugs into the brain of a mouse. It goes into bliss and it'll keep running around the wheel. As long as you keep getting. So it's very, compared to our normal experience, it can feel very transcendent. But that kind of Shakti, which is just energy, bliss created from the Kundalini slamming into the crown chakra and going out, is ultimately addictive, and doesn't create awakening per se, because it's all happening through the chakras are all part of the physical system. Now the crown can access higher levels of energy, but just the regular Kundalini hitting it doesn't do it. It creates a very physical type of samadhi. Now you have the subtle nervous system, which are the nadis, and there's a lot of them, of course, going to be sitting there in the spine. And when the channel itself is balanced and harmonized and clear, there can be this nadi activation, which is the subtle nervous system, which becomes a bridge for divinity to come into the spine. But so the Kundalini becomes a vehicle for activating that nadi level within it, and that can bridge divinity into the spine. Then, when that happens, you've got some kind of more awakening type of experience that's happening. But in general, there's a deeper kind of samadhi, which is a kind of a heart samadhi, which is the place where grace touches the heart, and it just feels like it's not this, which is an expansion. It's this melting, and that's a completely different thing. So people are looking. Spiritual seekers are always looking for expanded states, but expanded states are always states. They're not awakening. In awakening, there is no expansion, and in fact, when someone's talking about expansion, that's a red flag to me, telling me that they've gone into some state. I don't even have to look; just their language tells me. For expansion to happen, something needs to expand, and the only thing that can expand is the egoic mind. And I went to, years ago, this book by Papaji fell into my hands, and at the time, my process was just transforming all my stuff. That was just my process, and I would write it down, and and so I would get to live it again, and it got really boring. And Papaji's book fell into my hands, and reading it, the way he would come in and he would work with my consciousness, and I started to have these experiences, and then like 2 weeks in, I had my first full samadhi experience, which is very blissful. And I just expanded into this bliss place. And of course, I fell out because no state is permanent. Awakening is permanent, but states aren't. And I thought that was it. I thought that was awakening, and I had it and I lost it, And so I worked with them and it took me a month to get back to have another one of those. And of course, as soon as I had it, it fell right back out. Now I was depressed because I thought that was it and I didn't know how to stay there. And that was what got me to go to India. I didn't really want to go to India. I knew too many people who had gotten really badly sick there and didn't get well afterwards. And but I had to go see Papaji. I had to ask him how to stay there. And I found him. And I won't go into all that happened along the way of getting there. And I get there and he wasn't giving darshan. He had neck pain and was canceling it. And long story short, somehow I ended up being allowed to do energy work on him, and I fixed his neck, and he went back into giving darshan. Anyway, I got to ask him a question, and my question was, I had this experience where I had this, this complete bliss, and but I fell out, and how do I stay there? And his answer was really very simple. And he elaborated on it a bit, but the summation was, for every going, there's a return. He said, when you go, you attach a hook to wherever you left from, and you go back. And he gave me some other, bits and pieces, and I didn't really quite get it at the time. But for every going, there's a return. So for every expansion, there's a collapse, essentially. Right? In awakening, there's no expansion. So I still remember this one student that had gone into this expanded state, and it somehow stayed there for quite some time. And she wanted to know if that was awakening. So we talked about the core veil as being this sort of eye that sits in the heart, right? So if you imagine that a balloon and you paint an eye on the balloon, and then you blow the balloon up, if it gets big enough, you don't see the eye anymore because it's so spread out. So that's sort of where she was. So I couldn't see her eye, but I could sort of sense it was there. I sort of knew it was a state rather than awakening, but she was ripe for awakening. And so somehow I was able to facilitate, with whatever support I get from Merlin. I was able to facilitate that eye breaking down without having to break down her state first. While she was in her state, we managed to dissolve what was left of that core veil, and the whole state sort of collapsed. And so before that, if you asked her, what did she feel, she would say she felt expanded and so on, which again is a red flag that's telling me something that's not awakeness. And I said, well, how do you feel now? And she said, well, nothing. I said, that sounds more like it. Because awakening isn't a something. In initial awakening, you don't really awaken to what you are. You awaken out of who you thought you were. It's Wayne Lickerman likened it in his analogy. He said it's not like getting a new pair of shoes. It's like taking an irritating stone out of an old pair of shoes. It's so, and as you awaken deeper, when the awakening gets to, what we call the 8th dimensional level, then the awareness starts to become awake to itself instead of just this sort of, kind of emptiness, which is there in the first stages. it becomes this fullness of light, love, intelligence, and so on. Um, so, um, so that's the difference between states of expansion versus actual awakening. In awakening, there's nowhere to go, as Papaji would say. There's nowhere to go. It's this. This is it.
I would like to share with you, what I would call my awakening story, and also my experience with vortex healing, and then get your view on it, and from there dive deeper into some more topics. In 2022, I joined an ayahuasca ceremony. And I know there's, this topic has been coming in the vortex healing community. Maybe you could share your view in general on plant medicines and about the ayahuasca hooks and how that also changed recently.
Everything has its place. And, in the day, I certainly, used plant medicines. And they were, some of those experiences were critical for my own, understanding and growth and so on. Now, ayahuasca in particular comes out of a certain area of the Amazon, and there's a spirit that inhabits, that comes in. Let's just say it comes in when one does that plant. And you might say the function you might say the consciousness of the Amazon of that plant is to help those tribes that live in that area to be connected to its environment. And so it pulls them into a certain oneness with that environment, and creates a certain kind of hook into them so that they maintain, even when they're not on the plant, they maintain that connection, some of that connection to that environment. Perfect thing for the people living in that environment. And you get some people from New York City going, I want to go to the Amazon and do ayahuasca. And, and they go and they get hooked, like everyone else who's local who's doing the ayahuasca. And they go back to New York City, except part of their consciousness is still hooked into the jungle. And it's a real energetic hook, and a pretty dense one that, would go through the right kidney and into their spine. And if you would release that hook, which I did numerous times, suddenly they become more present because, a piece of them was literally gone. So if you're not, living in that jungle, you shouldn't have a piece of your consciousness, stuck there. At some point, because of these hooks, one of our students did a very lovely thing where they sat and they meditated with the being there, or the consciousness of that plant, and tried to inform it about the nature of, Westerners, and how it wasn't good for them to be hooked. And when the hook got much gentler. It didn't disappear completely, but the whole power of that, out of that conversation, got modified. And then at some point, I think it was last year, maybe it was the year, now we're in 2024, so say a couple of years ago, something drew me back into that, probably some students talking about it, and I got the plant to actually stop hooking Westerners and to let go of whatever hooks were in Westerners, so that it wasn't doing that anymore. At the same time, for people that had done it some time back, what can happen is, so that hook goes in, and then it sits there not being used in a very active way over time. you might say it becomes sort of like dead wood in the system, which is just debris and a certain kind of blockage. So that people who've, um, who used it, they're not hooked anymore, but many of them will have this sort of, dead wood from it in their system still. But at least now when Westerners use it, um, they're having whatever experience they're having, which can be very useful, um, valuable according to wherever people are, especially if they're not abusing it and they're using it in a spiritual way as opposed to just to get high. And now they're not being hooked by it anymore.
Is it the same hook also when you do it outside the jungle? Let's say New
Yes,
York people do it in New
yes,
York. Yeah,
yes.
still the
It
same
was
hook.
it was the same hook, yes. But it doesn't now, it's like you might say a certain kind of hook needs to get created for the experience, but then as you come down, it's just withdrawn. It's not maintained.
So after my ayahuasca retreat, like 1 or 2 months later, I um, joined this meditation course by Jeffrey A. Martin. And I know in the community of Jeffrey, there are a lot of people who joined Vortex Healing also some years ago. So it's, I would say, yeah, popular topic in there. And in this course, after like 4 or 5 weeks of at least 1 or 2 hours of meditation every day, I had this transition to what in Jeffrey's map of consciousness is called location 3. So I would feel basically the whole day like love is flowing around me, like love is everywhere, like divine fullness, divine love, like a thick liquid, a thick ocean that's everywhere of love and compassion. And sometimes I would feel like a Care Bear, like shining that out into the world. And this is what I had for exactly 1 year. Plus, there was less identification with Max. So I was still feeling as Max, but it was like less strong. Yeah. Do you see any correlation there to awakening in vortex healing?
Well, yes and no, in that one can't really correlate, our map to someone else's map. Because as I said, you can have someone. It's possible for someone to have this like profound experience where they feel all this love, um, and and act from there without actually awakening, and you can have an awakening where you know their emotional expression doesn't significantly change. Um, so it becomes hard to. In fact, I mean, my sense is that you were awakening. You did have awakening then, but you know, it, um, but that's just me trying to track what was actually happening for you there. But that someone might have a similar experience and they might not have awakening there, and so it can just depend. Um, so if you go into um, different like Hindu and Buddhist, you know, you know, um, lineages, I guess you can say. Um, the use of language, like take the word enlightenment. If you asked a dozen Buddhists and a dozen Hindus what they mean by it, you're going to probably get 24 different answers. So it becomes very hard to correlate when you don't have any fixed defined term on the other side. Uh, and so we had to come up with our own language for different states of awakening, which we did. So for us, awakening very concretely and specifically means the loss of the core veil. It doesn't define anything about behavior. So it's not something that can be defined by how a person is acting, or it's defined by the loss of the core veil, and um, And for some people, when they lose their core veil, it can be very profound. And other people who are, let's say, very stuck in their head or very locked in certain kinds of positional things, they can lose that core veil and have no sense that something has changed because they're so in the part. Remember, everything changes and nothing changes. And they're so locked into what isn't changing, then they don't notice what's changed, right? And if they're more fluid in their awareness, then they notice that their relationship to all that has changed. But yes, I would say that, that you did awaken them. So it was great.
So in the weeks and months afterwards, I actually, as far as I remember, I received my own first vortex healing with a healer from the US. And I still remember the first session that we had. And she was saying, oh yeah, I'm like looking in your left testicle right now. And I was like, holy shit, why do I feel that? And I could just sense where she was looking in my body at the time. And I was like, yeah, maybe that's real. Like maybe this actually works. So that was my first experience with vortex healing. And then in May of 2023.
That was very ballsy of you.
Yeah. in May of 2023, I was on a retreat in Greece. And I would start seeing these lights in my body coming, I would say, from my root chakra, like a white spiral light coming up, like white particles, slowly flowing up all the time. I could always see it. And I would started to see like light spheres in my hands. And I had just no idea what that was, but I would just see it every day for some weeks. Do you have any sense of what this is or was?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, and then following after that, I joined the foundational training with Anthony. And yeah, during the foundational training, I had moments where I feel that this location 3 thing of divine love changed into probably location 2 on Jeffrey's map, which would be there was no inside and outside or no distance between things in a way. There was just this, melting into oneness in a way. And I had this for just some hours maybe, and then I would like be back in like the normal awareness that I had before. And at the end of the foundational training on Friday night, where, it was the last day after 5 days, and I get a message from a friend in the US, and I didn't communicate it with him for like 2-3 months, and he just was like, hey, how are you? What's going on? And I told him, hey, yeah, I just did this vortex healing training, 1 week, super cool. If you ever want to try it out, let me know. And he immediately wrote me, oh, Max, that's perfect, because I had this rib injury and this pneumonia in my lungs, and I'm feeling really sick for 2 weeks already. Can you help me? And I was like, I guess, I just did the training, so maybe I could help you. And then the next day we had this session, like 50-minute session over Zoom. And I just followed the basic foundational protocol. And then we hang up the call, and he sends me a message the next day like, hey, Max, we need to talk about what happened. And then he told me like what happened during the session. And he said he closed his eyes. He would see all these lights. He would, the first time in his life, understand why he had asthma his whole life, because he could trace it back to his childhood, where he was growing up in a bookstore with a lot of paper and dust. And he told me like he felt like his lungs, his insides just got cleared out immediately. And he said since that point, like he felt completely fine.
That's
And
the
I was
power of
like,
vortex healing. It's
yeah,
amazing stuff. It's just amazing stuff. And that's just
I
foundational level.
I was pretty speechless, but also there was a part in my mind, a rational part that said, well, how do you know it's real? Like maybe it's a coincidence. How do you actually know that it comes from that? Yeah.
Well, what happens is as you do more sessions on different people, you see that, results are fairly consistent, that, that it's not a coincidence. And in fact, at one point because of course one can imagine that there can be a placebo effect, but vortex healing works so deeply it actually can change the resonance of physical matter. So, we can take a musical instrument, and in a lot of the articles are written about vortex healing, they write about this. We can take a musical instrument and completely improve the sound of it. The first time I did that for a woman's violin who was in an orchestra, the next day her orchestra leader asked her if she had a new violin. And and so I took some instruments into a sound lab with a sound engineer, and we did a before and after, and you can see like the harmonics in the printouts, and you can see the change in the harmonics. So the that the flute doesn't have a placebo effect.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So on the one hand, one instrument was like this cheap plastic flute, and you'd play this note, and it would have that you see in the printout this note, but there'd be all this sort of stuff around it, which was just noise. And after like a 30-second healing, you play it again, and you see the printout, and almost all the noise is gone. Or with the guitar, you do the before, and you see the harmonics, and then you do the after, and suddenly there are new harmonics there that weren't there before. So I mean, and, and that's just like a 30-second thing, and so if you can imagine impacting physical matter in a way like that in 30 seconds, working on a fluid bioenergy system consciousness package for an hour, what can happen? I mean, there's just so much grace and power in it.
Yeah, I worked on maybe 12 people or so until now, and did more classes with Anthony. Yeah, and now I feel there's definitely more trust in that this works, and I'm pretty sure that when I do it, I feel it, and I know that it's the Merlin energy channeling. Yeah, but this is still something that where I feel like the trust is still growing, and there's still sometimes the rational mind, with a lot of things, also with awakening, that the rational
Sure.
mind is questioning certain things.
Absolutely, and it should be. I mean, that's its job. If you don't question, you can't become convinced.
Right. And in October last year, I went to a Buddhist retreat, a 7-day meditation retreat, and in there I had this change. And on their map, so we have all these different maps of awakening, but on their map they call this awakened awareness. So I transitioned to that, to a non-dual awareness, which is stable, which to me reminded me of what I felt just for some hours in the foundational training with Anthony. But now it's the whole day. Now there is no inside, no outside. There's just this one ocean, and where it feels like everything appearing is just, really like water in the ocean.
Yeah. For me, that's not non-dual. I think that word non-dual is used too freely.
Yeah. So
So,
what would be that for you?
so for me, non-dual, it's like you look at someone like Amma, who is doing all this stuff for all these different people, around the world. And, and that's the lens we see her through, is all this humanitarian stuff she's doing for everyone. For her, it's not like that at all. Because for her, there is no other. That's a very, very different kind of place. Ongoing experience of no other. It's just the one doing its thing for itself. See, to me, that's what non-duality really is. And um, whereas, you know, we can observe that there is no other, but until we've moved into true non-duality, there's duality there in that observing. Alma doesn't observe that there's no other. There just is no other.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, and that's what this podcast is about, like really trying to understand awakening and exploring that from different maps and different languages.
So for instance, for myself, we use the word self, but if I actually look for, that's the mind's conception in terms of functioning, the what I call the functional consciousness, generates a functional concept of self as a way of navigating through the world. But if I actually look for a certain quality of self, there's nothing there, right? So there's the experience, the direct experience, is that there is no self, even though mind will operate as if there's self.
Mm-hmm.
But even though there's no self, it's not in that. And so if I look for boundaries, I don't find any boundaries, right? And it's very easy for me to move awareness in and out of things out there. But there's still this sense of other, even though if I look for other than what, I don't find anything.
Yeah.
Right?
But there's still an understanding right now. We're doing a podcast, right?
Right. And I mean, and Amma would have the understanding that she's doing a podcast, but there wouldn't be an experience of other with it, though. It would all be just different expressions of herself doing its thing in creation. And it wouldn't be conceptual, it would be experiential.
Yeah. There's also sort of this limit to language when we talk about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we use these words, that somebody could listen to this and just think, oh yeah, I'm having these words as my thought, as a mental concept, so I'm experiencing what they're talking about.
Right. And that happens a lot with Neo-Advaita. Neo-Advaita is a particular awakening lineage where they say, they're trying to start from the end. And so they'll tell people that there is no process, there's nothing for them to do, because there's no one that's really there, so there's nothing for anyone to do. And Papaji would often talk like that, but he specifically said that for a certain select few, that kind of conceptual framework could be a shortcut, But he didn't go and say, that means you and everyone else can leave. So what you would see around Papaji is that a lot of people would get this kind of, mental awakening, if you will, just exactly what you're saying, where where they would understand it on a conceptual level, and they think they got it. But you can see the awakening hadn't gone through the heart. And they could get stuck there for a very long time because they would have sort of gotten stuck in this place with this little, a certain headspace, and they think that's awakening. And so they're not even looking to go deeper. And their philosophy is that they shouldn't be looking because there's nothing for them to do. And so they end up just being stuck there for a long time. And the only thing that wakes them up then is basically hanging out with their teacher who's awake, and then the resonance over time maybe wakes them up. So you end up having a lot of that. And of course, you don't need to be Neo-Advaita to have that happen either. You read a book and you think, I got it.
So from your sensing of my consciousness, where do you sense I am on the vortex healing map?
Well, for us, you've lost your core veil, and you've lost your core veil. That's where you are on our map. Mm-hmm. But you have some very nice embodiment in it. So you've got on the vertical, you've lost the core veil, and on the horizontal, you've had some nice embodiment with it, and through, like these retreats you're doing, and, you're deepening into that space, that awake space. Hasn't gone to the seventh dimension yet, which we call awakening to being awareness, to being consciousness. To me, it hasn't gone there yet.
Well, yeah, I'm sticking to the path of vortex healing, definitely, and see where that leads.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the end you want to share? Any other topic, or should we share, I don't know, your offerings, or where people can find vortex healers? Anything you want to plug or promote?
Sure, let's just start with that. So anyone who wants to experience a vortex healing session, first of all, I don't do them. I just teach and run the lineage. But on the website, vortexhealing.org, there's a button on the upper right that says Find a Healer. And vortex healing works fantastically at a distance. You don't need to find someone who lives next door to you. And you can see what level of training people have had. And it explains their, what the highest level is. And so you can find a practitioner, and, you can call more than one, and, prices are going to be different, of course. And you want to find someone that you resonate with. And there's information on the website if you're interested in taking a foundational class. If you're in Europe, you'd be taking it with Anthony. If you're in the Eastern U.S., you'd be taking it with Lorraine. In the Western U.S. with Galen. And if you're out in Australia and that part of the world, you'd be taking it with Daniel. And at this point, if you were in South America, you'd probably be taking it with Lorraine. And so all the information you might need, and more information about vortex healing is there. I have a couple of books you can see on the website. One is about vortex healing, and the other is about awakening, called Awakening Through the Veils, A Seeker's Guide, and where I present our map of awakening and how a lot, what we've been talking about today. We have this sort of paradox on the awakening path, because we want to awaken, and it's important to recognize that that who you think you are is not what awakens, right? It's not like the Ric or the Max that awakens. And the analogy I use is, imagine you have a dream in which you're a monkey, and you're jumping around enjoying bananas and jumping from tree to tree. And then you wake up out of the dream. You don't go, oh, the monkey woke up. It's just you stopped dreaming that you're a monkey. And so, in a similar way, whatever has, in its root, has dreamt you into this experience, that wakes up out of this experience. And so, on the one hand, the path takes the form of the ego striving for awakening. And awakening eventually happens through that, but it doesn't happen to the ego. For the ego, it's actually a losing game. The ego keeps losing more and more of itself as awakening keeps getting, deeper and deeper. Awakening is a no-I zone, and so when I first woke up, as I said, I was in the schizoid state, and the mind would be trying to understand what happened, but it can't. That egoic mind can't, and it would have to become still, and then whatever was occupying the egoic mind would appear in the heart, and there it would be, and then it would pop back up into the mind and be trying to understand it, and it couldn't. But the part of the deepening in the path is also the letting go of the striving, because the striving is an ego function. So on the one hand, it's following the guidance, but if you're striving as you're following the guidance, it tightens things and makes you less available for transformation to happen. And so even at most advanced levels is this constant sort of letting go of the striving, and more of the allowing. So one is still actively looking and opening and following wherever the path is going, but one is letting go of the striving as one's doing that. And then for that to happen, one needs to trust. Because if you don't trust, then you think, well, I need to do it. If I'm not striving to do it, if I'm not trying to do it, it's not going to happen. So it requires a certain level of trust to be able to let go and just allow. And so, that's where faith comes in. So in the end, it comes back to faith. But, the mind is very tricky. The ego can use faith as, to its own advantage of keeping itself intact. Like it can say, well, I have faith I'm going to get there, so I'm just going to do whatever the fuck I want in the meantime. And I saw a lot of people who were around Papaji. There were a lot of Osho followers, who Osho was gone, and they were doing some of that. Papaji would say, on the one hand, he would sometimes do that Neo Advaita stuff of saying there was nothing you can do, but he's saying that to just stop people's minds, and he'd have this energy that can then pull them through that opening that would happen. But he would also say that, that the only desire you have that is, he wouldn't use the word good, but he would say all your desires take you out away from yourself, except for your desire for awakening, because that desire takes you back in. And so, what he was basically saying is that one could cultivate that desire, and instead of just following everything else. And but a lot of the Osho folks, there was a lot of just sort of pleasure-seeking stuff in the whole way that unfolded, and people got conditioned by it, and so you would see a lot of them just sort of saying, well, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. So in the meantime, I'm just going to do whatever, as opposed to cultivating that place that wants to awaken. So it's a very subtle dance of, having faith, and which gives you the space to not be rigid on yourself, because being rigid with yourself becomes another kind of striving, right? Okay, I'm gonna meditate for an hour every day, regardless of whatever's going on for me, and I'm gonna really be So there's a striving, and there is a control, and there's a rigidity there that blocks flow. But the opposite also, doesn't help, which is, I'll meditate if I feel like it. I haven't really felt like it in a long time. It's so there's this dance, and one needs to have the intention to be alert to our own motivations, to our own self-deceptions, and to always be seeking the truth about what we're doing. And so it's this sort of combination of faith and truth. And truth becomes really a very important thing in relationships. Like, you're in a relationship, and let's say you're having doubt about the relationship. Now, for 99% of people, if the relationship feels good, it means they stay. And if it feels bad, it means they leave. From an awakening perspective, from a truth perspective, feeling good and feeling bad have nothing to do with it whatsoever. Truth is either you stay or truth is you leave. It's really very simple. It might be that the relationship feels terrible and it's the best place for you to be in terms of your growth. And it may be that the relationship feels good and it's complete stagnation. Mm-hmm. Truth. And one way to find truth is you let your mind just go crazy over it until you exhaust it, and then you sit and you wait. Because now your mind is just tired, and it creates a space where you can just sit and wait for truth to just emerge. And when it emerges, if you follow it, there's no regret. Because if you made up your mind about what to do, then later you went, did I make the right decision? Maybe I could have, right? But if it emerges from truth, you didn't make it from your mind, so there's no changing your mind, and there's no regret, there's no looking back. So it's this combination of faith and truth is what most rapidly gets you down the road.